Welcome back, everyone. After months of traveling around, we are finally back in Dubai. So this is great because, frankly, traveling for a long time is really annoying, even though it's also really good, so it goes both ways. Anyway, we're going to talk today about a subject which may on the surface seem kind of dull, but I think is actually, paramount to the understanding of how our society functions. And this is how case law works, how the common law system works, which is really quite brilliant. We're going to discuss it and why you should understand it if you're going to kind of dive down any of these rabbit holes of realizing how to plan your kind of international structure for yourself, or working with various different lawyers on issues of liability or dozens of other situations. So let's dive in today. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Thank you for being with us. I am Lord Michael, here to talk to you guys today from Offshore Citizen. If you haven't been here before, we help people to figure out the best international solution for themselves, totally agnostically about jurisdiction or whatever. We're going to scour the globe for what is the best option, and this includes residencies, citizenships, where to form companies, how to optimize your global tax, etc. We help people figure out how to do it and implement it. So if those things are interesting to you, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or you can send a message through offshorecitizen.net. All right, now, background on the legal system, and I'll probably give a general concept of building legal frameworks in general, which is pretty interesting if you're going to get involved in things like DAOs or building some sort of model for how to govern and make decisions. So you have typically some sort of a constitution, right? That framework, which basically tells how rules, etc., are made. Then you have the actual statutes, which is the laws themselves. And then within that, you are going to have case law and agreements. Now, I think it's worth understanding, before I ever had anything to do with law, it was easy to make fun of lawyers and make lawyer jokes, and granted, there's some funny lawyer jokes out there. It was also easy to criticize the laws and think, this is asinine, this is terrible, but the more you dive into it, you discover that most of these things make sense, and hopefully in some of our videos, when I'm explaining how CFC rules work, or how management and control rules work, or how source income rules work, etc., I explain to you why those rules work that way. And when you understand it, you realize, actually, these are pretty sensible. And yeah, there's variations on it. You can understand how there are edge cases that are tough to navigate, and maybe you can optimize it. I'll do another video a little bit later on today about one of the changes that's being made in UAE as an example, which is really fantastic in terms of their optimizations, and you could contrast it with, say, someplace like Bulgaria that doesn't do it particularly well. But on the whole, the concept behind the rules makes quite a lot of sense in most cases, and I think that's in particular true if it is grounded in something real and arises out of a degree of plurality, meaning there are many different voices from many different places who weigh in on what that law should look like. Now, it doesn't mean that these laws are all perfect. In fact, none of them are perfect. Lots of them have deep flaws. I would argue that there's plenty of room for improvement, but fundamentally there are really important reasons why things are the way they are. And in my opinion, it's always useful to understand why things are the way they are before you try and change them. So let's talk about particularly what we would call the British common law system. This is essentially inherited from the British Empire. We of course know that historically the sun never set on the British Empire. They were all over the place. And so the vestiges of their colonialism have left traces all over the world, whether you're talking about India, or you're talking about Malaysia, or you're talking about the US, or you're talking about Australia, et cetera, et cetera. All these places have been influenced by the British system. And there are different variations. For those who aren't familiar, there's basically three loose types of legal systems in the world. They would be Sharia law, which is deeply misunderstood as well, civil law, and common law. So today we're talking about common law, okay? And common law is fundamentally based on the idea of case law. So the important thing to note is you have statutes, right? So statutes are essentially the laws that get made and written. If you notice Parliament in a particular place is debating something, Congress is passing some law, they're going to put out some sort of a statute. Now, the inherent consequence of that law being put out is that you're in a situation where there is no possible way that the people drafting it are going to think of all the possible scenarios and edge cases that are going to develop around that law. And the result of this is you're going to have courts interpret. Now, I generally think that it's probably a wise thing to say if it's really hard to figure out what a law is saying, probably the law should be rewritten and you shouldn't be able to be held accountable for it. And certainly I think there's lots to be said for going back and modifying laws afterwards based on the collective wisdom of having it challenged through various court cases or interpreted through various court cases. But the idea is you have a law, people are behaving in a certain way. Let's just use a simple example, which might be something like management and control. Okay, so management and control, I've done videos on this before, is a part of corporate residency in a lot of the world. And this is a way they determine if a company is resident in that country or somewhere else. And they say, okay, where is it centrally managed and controlled? Now, if you just think about this, this is not actually an easy question to answer, right? I can say it, conceptually it makes sense. Okay, yeah, where the main central management of the company is based, that's really where the company in substance exists, regardless of what is on paper. That concept makes sense. But when you get into it and you start realizing, okay, well, maybe we have shareholders in different countries. Maybe there's different people at different levels who have different decision making. Maybe you have employees and operations in one country and you've got something else going on in another country. How do you decide where this is? What if people are traveling at the time when they're making decisions? You have a digitally mobile workforce today. You could easily have a director of a company who is normally based in one place, who happens to be in another place. Do they have to travel all to the same place? How do you decide what this is? What are those functions? And I wrestle with this and discuss it with clients quite a bit. We just finished a gargantuan analysis for a client, and there was like a very deep analysis of this particular thing, right? Explaining how the ATO sees it, how HMRC sees it, how all these different guidance documents figure out what that might be. And it's not easy, right? So because of this, granted, hopefully you would think that the lawmakers would put a lot of thought into doing that really well, but it turns out they're just going to overlook things. And therefore it is left to the courts to interpret. Now, it's noteworthy that we have a system where the courts do not make laws, they merely interpret laws. And some people get upset about court decisions. There might be, for example, the really common one in the past year was the issue of abortion, right? In the US, they say, okay, the Supreme Court in the US overturned Roe v. Wade, and there's a certain set of narrative which is like, oh, they're legislating. Well, they're not legislating actually. They're simply saying, hey, this law or this previous ruling is being struck down because we're finding that it's not in alignment with another body of law. And it's up to the lawmakers then to go and make a law that brings whatever it is that their interpretation or desire is. So that's a really important concept in itself, is this separation of interpretation. Now, what happens though is when the judge goes through and interprets the law for a particular situation, they are going to write an opinion. And that opinion is going to essentially structure their logic of how they made this decision. And notably, what is really kind of unique and special about the common law system is that opinion becomes what we call case law. Case law is not the making of a law itself per se, but the legal framework of how future cases will be interpreted. So the judge is putting down their analysis of, okay, based on the laws and based on the circumstances and based on sort of understanding reasonableness, how should this be interpreted? What are some, clearly it can't go this way and it can go that way, but it could also go this way here. What is our criteria? And they'll lay this down, and forever afterwards, unless it's overturned by a higher court or the law changes, that becomes the new framework of interpretation for future cases, so that you don't have to go through the same thing over and over again, and you don't have to face the uncertainty of knowing how this is interpreted. So what you end up with is, in a sense, a ever-growing body of law that helps to interpret a broad range of situations and give people more legal certainty as to how to expect future judgments to play out and therefore how to behave. And so I think it's worth understanding. Hopefully this was a reasonable explanation for you, but definitely realize that the law is the one part, but often the law is ambiguous. So then you get case law. Now sometimes there isn't case law yet. Okay, sometimes, for example, when Malaysia has the statement that they only tax local source, domestic source income, they don't define source income in statute. And so for quite some time, when there were early cases, there was no definition of source income in the laws in Malaysia, and there ended up being some court cases, and those court cases actually looked at rules in Hong Kong and Singapore to interpret this. Much like you'll see, say, for management and control, the Australian courts have looked to the British courts to see how they interpreted it and borrowed from some of those cases in determining how they should interpret this set of rules. But once they do, now you have a set of rules that gives you some certainty. You can say, okay, here's how it should be going forward. Now, again, there may still be some ambiguity. There's a different edge case, and so that may take another court case. And gradually you build on these one after another. And it's essentially like iterating a product until you get a product that has a lot of collective wisdom in it built over time, even though it seems a little rough around the edges for somebody who is new to it and has to kind of dig through, well, what are the court cases that apply, and how did this ruling work, and what if the facts are different in this case than that case. It is still better than just trying to figure it all out from the scratch and not knowing where to go from there. So I hope that helps. If you have questions, put them in the comments below. Share with me any insights that you have, and I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.